Good morning, welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 196, if you can believe that, 196, Stories from Invergordon. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn, I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. We have 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland. We have one in Inverness, one in Wick, one in Portree and one in Fort William. And together the 4 of those make up the Highland Archive Service. We look after documents from the 1200s all the way through to the present day, and this series is about telling some stories from those collections. A reminder, if you're a piece of information if you're new to us, that you can go back and watch all the previous 195 episodes on the High Life Highland YouTube channel or on any of our 4 office Facebook pages as well. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there is no payment or subscription required to take part. But if you're able to donate towards the work of the Archive Service, then we really appreciate that. And I know many of you have done so, so thank you for that. So this week we are continuing a kind of sporadic series that I've been running through the last couple of years, looking at some of the larger settlements and communities in the Highlands. And this week we're looking at Invergordon. So as always, let's start by locating ourselves for those who don't know the area as well. Invergordon is on the east coast of the county of Ross and Cromarty. It is in the civil parish of Roskeen and it sits on the Cromarty Firth. If you're looking at a map, it's about halfway between Tain to the north and Dingwall or Fortrose to the south. About 25 miles north of Inverness, and as I say, sitting on the Cromarty Firth, which as we will see is very important. It is and has always been important for its port, its deep water port, and today it's the first place in the Highlands that thousands of people encounter when they step off cruise ships. In 2023 there were around 130 cruise ships which brought over 220,000 visitors to the Highlands that came in at Invergordon. When I was researching for this, I found a quote that described Invergordon's port as the second best natural harbour in the world, next only to Sydney, Australia. So there you go. Like many places, Invergordon has borne several names over the course of its history. The area was first known as Anrua, which means the headland or the promontory, and then Inverbreckie, the mouth of the Breckie. And Inverbreckie remained a relatively small settlement for many years, although often that harbour and that coastline played a role. And it passed through several families' hands over the course of the centuries. And the first statistical account of 1792 for the parish of Roskeen records that there is a village of some extent upon the Ness of Invergordon in a dry heathy beach where vessels of 100 tons burden can lie with safety most seasons of the year and can receive or deliver their cargoes close to the shore. So even in 1792, what they're writing about Invergordon is the fact that there's a village there, but particularly that vessels of up to 100 tons burden can lie with safety almost all year round and can get close into the shore to deliver or pick up things. We'll come back to that. That 1792 statistical account also noted that very few situations indeed in the north of Scotland seem better adapted for a manufacturing village than the Ness of Invergordon. The second statistical account of 1845 for the parish of Roskeen gives this really beautiful description of Invergordon, I think, of the parish, but particularly of Invergordon. This parish, as we have already mentioned, is situated on the northern shore of the Firth of Cromarty and is bounded by it for a distance of nearly 6 miles. The Firth finds entrance between the 2 hills known by the name of the Suitors of Cromarty and runs up into the country a distance of about 20 miles and is almost surrounded by an amphitheatre of hills between which and the shore lies a well-wooded and fertile country. The scenery of the Firth is remarkably fine. From the Ness of Invergordon, the spectator can, on a clear summer evening, obtain a view of rarely equalled beauty. Looking to the east, across the broad waters of the Murray Firth, the finest waterpiece in Britain, he can discern in the distance, skirting the horizon, the distinctly defined coast of Moray. Nearer, he beholds the suitors of Cromarty uprearing themselves on either side of the gateway through which the waters of the Firth enter, and which, immediately within these natural barriers, expand into a broad and beautiful bay, with the sweetly situated town of Cromarty on the south side, and on the north a rich and fertile country with a magnificent background of hills. Turning his eyes westward, the spectator would see the calm and peaceful Firth, stretching up further than the eyes can well reach, and bordered on the north side by a strip of richly wooded and comparatively level country. In the distance may be perceived the mountain monarch Benwyvis, rising high into the clear blue air his snowy summit, and surrounded by 100 ancient hills, like so many chiefs round a sovereign, while to the southwest the view is bounded by the huge and many-peaked Invergordon. The general depth of the Firth is between 15 and 20 fathoms. It preserves this depth for 12 or 14 miles, and after that it shoals considerably. It's navigable, however, at full tide for vessels of considerable size to its furthest extremity. So again, that first of all, that talking about the scenery and the views, love the description of Benwyvis and all his chiefs standing around him. But again, that focus on the depth of the Firth and the fact that it's navigable is important. Now you'll also maybe notice there that it's changed from being called Inverbrechy to being called Invergordon, and it became known as Invergordon in the early 18th century after Sir William Gordon purchased the estate and renamed it after himself. Sir William Gordon would go on to become MP for Sutherland and for Cromartyshire and become Sheriff of Ross. Now, he started to plan a bigger town on that Inverbrechy estate, renamed as Invergordon, but it was really his son, Sir John Gordon, who went on to become an MP and I believe also Secretary of State for Scotland, who was responsible for the development and laying out of Invergordon. It then passed in around 1780 to the MacLeods of Cadboll, who are the other main family associated with the story of Invergordon, both town and Invergordon Castle. I'm not going to go into the MacLeods of Cadboll here at all because there's a previous episode on that, a previous Learn with Lorna, episode 138, if you want to go back and watch that to tie it in with Invergordon's story. Now, a few years after the MacLeods of Cadboll took over, this advert appeared in the Press and Journal. It's also published in 1792, the same year as that first statistical account, so you hear some of the almost identical wording. Intimation to manufacturers that the village of the Ness of Invergordon, north side of the ferry of that name, Rossshire, is particularly well adapted for carrying on a manufactory, is admitted by all those who are acquainted with its commodious situation. So he's saying nobody is denying that Invergordon will be a wonderful place to have manufacturing. The village is built on a healthy and pleasant stance in the most plentiful and populous country where labour is remarkably cheap. Ships of considerable burden can lie close to the shore. There is a large slated stone house of 3 flats or stories in height, above 100 feet in length, with a back court of considerable extent, with shades also slated and enclosed in a high wall. Any person whom such an eligible situation may suit can be accommodated with ground to build upon on reasonable terms, as Mr. MacLeod of Cadboll, the proprietor, is determined to give every proper encouragement to an undertaking of this kind. From whom, by Invergordon, writers, you can write in to get further particulars on this subject. So almost exactly the same wording, that this is a place of huge potential for manufacture. And the town clearly grew apace from then on. In the second statistical account of 1845, it is stated that in the country part of this parish, the population has decreased, while in the villages there has been a corresponding increase. The number of the population now residing in Invergordon is 1,000. It goes on to say that there are 2 hemp manufactories in this parish, which together give employment to about 70 people, who receive each from 9 to 12 shillings per week, besides the spinning, which occupies a great number of females in the vicinity of the village of Invergordon. And of course, all those families who were coming in, who were working in those hemp manufactories or on the coast or in the spinning, they needed infrastructure. And we can see, if we look at the Ordnance Survey name book that accompanies the first edition Ordnance Survey map, that by the 1880s, Invergordon had the following. High Street, the principal street, is about half a mile in length and of great width, and south of and parallel to it are three narrower streets gradually shortening in length towards the shore of Cromarty Firth. At right angles to and running towards the shore are three streets and four very narrow lanes. The village now contains the Free Church, the parish school, a subscription library, two banks, a post office, three hotels and two public houses. The principal manufactories are a mill for the manufacture of artificial marinas and a coachwork. There are also two steam sawmills, one of which is pretty extensive. Situated on the Cromarty Firth, it possesses a good harbour and ferriage across to the Black Isle. It is amply supplied with water from a reservoir constructed in 1852 at Achnagarran, about 2 miles distant. A work for the manufacture of gas is at present in the course of erection. The land is the property of Aeneas MacLeod, Esquire of Cadboll, and to him are payable the few duties of the smaller properties. So we can see that it's really starting to flourish and grow. And when we turn to the records of Invergordon Public School, and we have some really fascinating records for the school, we can see what life was like in the school during those last decades of the 19th century as the town was flourishing. So there's an entry in the very first school logbook on the day that the school opens. And it's beautifully written. It's got the most gorgeous handwriting, but also in between paragraphs, he's drawn these sort of elaborate little scrolls, only for the first 2 pages, and then you think, yep, you ran out of time to carry that on. September the 2nd, 1875. This school was opened on Thursday morning in the town hall with praise and prayers by James King, headmaster. There were present several of the school board of the parish of Roskeen and a number of the parents of the pupils. After opening, Mr MacLeod of Cadboll, Invergordon Castle, in a very kindly speech, addressed the pupils and the teacher, expressing his hope that as the school was now organised for the first time under the Education Act for Scotland 1872, success might attend them in all of their labours. So they're starting to set up. They've obviously had a school within the parish before, but this is the first since the Education Act. That entry goes on to say that the school will be held in the town hall until the new public school is ready for occupancy. Now, you see there that MacLeod of Cadboll had commented in his speech that he hoped for success for all who attended Invergordon. Despite that wish, there were some teething problems initially, not the least, of course, that they didn't have their own school building. But the logbook shows that discipline wasn't great. But if there are any teachers watching, because it is school holidays, so might we have some teachers watching, it backs up some of the things that we know still happen, that there are issues with discipline, that the relationships with the parents can play a role in that, in the school's ability to deal with that, and also that the school environment can play a big role in how children are behaving and what's happening. Have a listen to these 2 entries from early in the school's story. The average this week, this is in April, the average this week is the highest recorded in this school, 201. I punished a boy for using improper language to the assistant master. Improper language, it should say, but it says improper language, to the assistant manager. Instead of the assistant master, instead of going to his duty, the boy left the school by a back door without my knowledge. I communicated with his father on this matter, and his father chose to take the boy's part and has for that reason withdrawn him from the school. And here's another entry. Inspector's report received today and is herewith subjoined. Class movements are attended with a good deal of noise. The younger children persistently speak in whispers, and there is a noticeable want of repose throughout this school. There are defects of discipline, no doubt partly attributable to the want of suitable classrooms. Now that these are being provided, it is hoped that by another year there will be a considerable improvement in the general tone of this school. I just think those things are very interesting because it's exactly what we know to be true, that environment within a school can make such a big difference. And as I say, that relationship where you can deal with the parents is always so important. We have a couple of more unusual types of record for Invergordon Public School, Invergordon Academy, including agreements signed with pupil teachers. And I haven't seen these before. I don't know if we maybe have other ones that I haven't looked at before, but we certainly don't have them within every school series. And these are written out agreements with between the school and the pupil teacher, which lay out those pupils, how old they are when they're supporting the teachers and teaching the class, what their hours will be, what their payments will be, and some other details from the early 1900s. And we also hold a letter book of outgoing correspondence from the school, which contains a wealth of information. And incidentally, it reveals that some 30 years later, in the early 1900s, discipline was still an issue with some of the pupils. And again, relationships with the parents. But there are also some really lovely letters about pupils in this letter book, like this one from 1906. Dear Sir, Grace Cram, so he's writing to Nisbet Esquire in Edinburgh. Grace Cram has been attending this school for 2 years and has been coming to it all of that time from the heights of Ardross, 5 miles from this. She has attended most regularly, facing courageously the rain, snow and wind of our Highland storms. She has, of necessity, to start very early in the morning and does not reach home again until late at night. Needless to say, she has been much handicapped in consequence of this, but she has worked with great spirit and is coming on to be one of our best pupils. Knowing the hardship that she has to endure, I have advised her that she is to stay in town should she be successful in gaining a bursary from your trust, and to this she has readily assented. This is an honest statement of the facts of this case, and I trust that this matter will receive the favourable consideration of your governors. The case is a most deserving one. And it's just a really lovely example of a teacher seeing potential in a pupil and going, look, she's having to leave early, she's having to get home late, she's so far away, but I can see potential in this pupil if she's given a chance. And I looked in the British Newspaper Archive and saw in the Highland News that she was indeed awarded a bursary. And if you turn on through the letter book several more pages, then you can see that the following year, the same rector is writing to Aberdeen Training College on Grace's behalf, saying she has obtained her full group certificate in higher English, in Latin, mathematics, lower French and drawing with endorsement, and she wishes to go to Aberdeen for further training, so is there any support that he could give her? I wonder what she did. I don't know what she went on to do, but she just seems to have been an incredibly bright girl with a real determination to study and learn. And incidentally, I had a quick look through, as I say, the British Newspaper Archive, and there seems to have been other equally clever family members. There was a Finlay Cram and some others at the same time also reaching the top of their class. Now, moving away from education for a second, I've mentioned previously in these kind of town type episodes how much I enjoy seeing the prominent aspects of each town or borough's story emerge. So trade is central to Inverness's growth, education is important to Fortrose, religion is absolutely fundamental to the way that Tame developed. And for Invergordon, as you've probably seen through all of that, the port has always been the main thing, providing a ferry route from the Black Isle on to Tame for those going on for pilgrimage, supporting the local community, but just generally that particularly notable deep water port has always been a big thing for the town's development. And so I'm going to finish by sharing some stories from the 20th century. Now I know we've got another over 10 minutes to go, but when I say finish, I mean I'm moving into the 20th century for the rest of this, when the port wasn't just important to locals, but was an absolutely vital part of Britain's military infrastructure and war effort, after becoming an official naval base in the early 1900s. So another use for that port. So let's start with a typed document that we hold entitled The Invergordon of Long Ago. This is a document typed by somebody in response to hearing someone else's reminiscences of Invergordon, and this person then wrote their memories of Invergordon, in which she details all sorts of different things, but including the regular visits of the home fleet in the early years of the 20th century, and then the huge increase in troops and in residents when Invergordon served as a full military naval base during World War I. We had a visit from the home fleet twice a year, in the spring and in the autumn. The whole Firth, from Cromarty right up as far as Eventon, would be full of ships, battleships, torpedo boats, submarines, etc. And when the ships were in port, the naval dances were very popular. They were held at the YMCA Hall, the Town Hall and the Territorial Hall. The halls were all decorated with flags and a ship's band provided the music. When I was about 17 years, I had a waltz from a young naval lieutenant who is now Lord Louis Mountbatten, Prince Philip's uncle. It was a lovely sight to see the sailors and the marines out marching, going in different directions, and the full brass bands playing. I used to love it. It goes on to say, during the First World War, Invergordon was a very busy place. Thousands of men were employed in the dockyard. They lived in huts from A to Z, and there was a big and busy post office situated in the middle of the huts. Mrs. Edwin Corbett and I were the first girl telegraph messengers in Invergordon. We were 14 years at the time, and were well acquainted with the huts, as we were always delivering telegrams up there. There were also thousands of soldiers in huts up the Castle Road, Cameron Highlanders and Army Service Corps, etc. Dozens of Metropolitan policemen came direct from London to here, and they guarded the dockyard gates. The American Navy were also here. So you really get a feel of how busy Invergordon is during the First World War. So the war was very close to home for the people of Invergordon, and it can be seen through every record type. If you look at the church minutes, if you look at the borough records, because Invergordon became a police borough in 1864, and also the records of the hospital, where you see the hospital being established by the Navy in World War I as a naval hospital. So you can see the impact of the First World War everywhere in Invergordon's story. And it was to a large extent Invergordon's importance that was the reason that the Highlands became designated a special military area in the First World War, requiring those living in and visiting the area to hold and present passes on demand. But perhaps the single event that brought the war very, very close to home for the people of Invergordon was the sinking of HMS Natal. And this is how we described the horrendous event on Ambala. The Cromarty Firth, which was used as a safe anchorage for the British fleet, was the scene of one of Britain's worst warship disasters. On the 30th of December 1915, a Hogmanay party and film show was underway on board HMS Natal, a 13,550-ton armed cruiser. Among the guests were the factor of Navarre Estate, Mr. Harry Dodds, his wife and 3 children, 3 nurses from the Naval Hospital at Cromarty, and Violet Black, wife of the captain, Eric Black. Without warning, the warship was ripped apart by an internal explosion. The ship turned over and sank within 5 minutes. 421 people, including the captain and all the guests, died, either in the explosion or subsequently from their injuries. Despite rumours of sabotage or an attack by an enemy submarine, an inquiry concluded that the explosion was probably the result of unstable cordite. Stored in the magazine room with insufficient ventilation, the cordite had begun to sweat and eventually spontaneously combusted. Wartime security meant that the incident could not be reported. The Rothshire Journal could only report that the Dodds family had been wiped out as a result of a painful and distressing accident. Many of the bodies were never found. Over time, the Natal gradually sank to the bottom, but for many years naval ships that passed it saluted on their way past. And there are Natal graves to be found in Roskeen Cemetery, in Cromarty Cemetery on the other side of the water, and in Kilturn Cemetery. Incidentally, around another 400 of the crew survived. Either they survived on board or they survived because they were on shore. But imagine that coming to Invergordon. Your life has already changed a lot with the outbreak of war, with these thousands of people turning up and working in the ports and in the docks. And then to see something that horrific happen so close to shore, 420 plus deaths, an enormous tragedy. And I found that really moving, that reference to the fact that for decades afterwards, if the Navy passed, they would stand on board and they would salute to the wreckage of the Natal. A few years later, the Navy at Invergordon were once again in the national headlines. Not that they were allowed to be in the headlines when the Natal sank originally, and this time it was because of the Invergordon mutiny. Now, in September 1931, the British Atlantic Fleet arrived in Invergordon to the news that the government, in an attempt to deal with the effects of the Depression, was planning to cut sailors' wages. Here's a description of what unfolded, again from Ambala. In 1931, the Treasury faced a budget deficit of £170 million. Among the recommendations of the Commission of National Expenditure was a reduction in pay to Royal Navy personnel of 10%. The news broke as the warships of the Atlantic Fleet gathered in Invergordon, and some newspapers mistakenly reported the reduction to be as high as 25% cut to the wages. A strike committee was formed which persuaded the sailors on 15 ships of the Atlantic Fleet not to obey orders until pay cuts were reviewed. The strike lasted for 2 days and was called off when wage cuts were withdrawn, but the mutiny was a contributory factor in sterling being taken off the gold standard. So this news that had hit them when they arrived, and not long after the First World War, of course, there were protest meetings held. Around 1,000 sailors went on strike, and no ships left the Cromarty Firth. And I read some of those press cuttings where they talked about the fact that it was going to be 25% cuts, which turned out not to be accurate, but it was particularly going to affect the lower ratings. It didn't last a huge amount of time, it just lasted a couple of days, but it did result in those pay cuts being reduced. I found this beautiful description in the Daily Record and Mail, of all things, of the fleet leaving again after the mutiny. And it has a huge headline: Fleet sails at midnight, Invergordon naval troubles end, Admiralty promise. Invergordon, Thursday morning. The Atlantic Fleet has sailed for its home ports. Half an hour before midnight they started to get underway, and in a few minutes, with HMS Hood, the flagship, leading the queue, their lights were fading down the Firth towards the suitors of Cromarty, the bold headlands which guard the narrow strait leading to the muddy Firth. The only unusual incident was a cheer from the men of HMS Hood as she left. On the promise that they would be taken to their home ports, where their respective commanders-in-chief will deal with cases of hardship, the men had agreed early in the morning to sail. The men were most insistent on getting a guarantee that they would be indeed taken to their home ports. They appeared to feel that if the fleet was dispersed to a number of isolated stations, their conduct would have been more severely dealt with. In addition to the offer to deal with the cases of hardship, there came an instruction that anyone who refused to do duty would be dealt with under the Naval Discipline Act, which, for an offence such as disobeying orders, permits considerable penalties. The frame of mind in which the men of the Atlantic Fleet have made their protest is indicated by the following letter, which has been sent on behalf of all the lower deck ratings to the Admiralty. We, the loyal subjects of H.M. the King, do hereby present to my Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty our representatives and implore them to amend the drastic cuts in pay which have been inflicted upon the lowest paid men of the lower deck. It is evident to all concerned that these cuts are the forerunners of tragedy, misery, and immorality amongst the families of the lower deck. And unless a guarantee written agreement is received from the Admiralty, confirmed by Parliament, stating that our pay will be revised, we are still to remain in one place, refusing to serve under the new rate of pay. The men are quite agreeable to a cut which they consider to be within reason. It's interesting there that they're saying we're if you have to take a pay cut, we'll take a pay cut, we understand, but it can't be that severe. But also the issue was that it was going to come into effect before they had had time to get home and speak to their families. So anyway, this agreement was signed, and there's a really beautiful description of them leaving. Dawn yesterday unveiled the familiar picture of the long line of ships, mirrored in the calm waters, stretching from Invergordon to Cromarty, the brilliant lights making the line look like a city afloat. At the appointed hour, the morning bugle ran out and the ship started to wake to life. Voices shouted orders, and for a moment or two there were all the ordinary noises. Then there were some unusual ones. 3 cheers came from the Rodney. A response came from the Hood, the next in line, and then each ship took up the demonstration. It was a novel addition to the ordinary morning routine, and the crew of the Rodney added a fresh touch by singing "The More We Are Together." And some of those sailors who were involved in the mutiny were disciplined, and some did indeed leave the Navy. Now, during World War II, Invergordon played a slightly different role. It was thought now that the Cromarty Firth was too accessible with the developments that had come in weaponry, in ships, in technology. It was thought that the Cromarty Firth now was too accessible to be a full, for Invergordon to be a full naval dockyard. But it was still used as a major Royal Naval refuelling station. There were still Royal Navy bases and things there. And there were large numbers of naval personnel in the area, as well as RAF personnel. And the Cromarty Firth was now used by flying boat squadrons. There were also substantial numbers of army personnel in Invergordon in World War II, and in World War One, and in World War II there were units of soldiers stationed there, particularly Polish units. And that hospital that had been built by the Navy in World War One was again requisitioned by the Admiralty, becoming the Royal Naval Auxiliary Hospital, and the famous Inchindown sunken tanks were built for fueling. If you haven't looked up the Inchindown tanks, definitely do that, they're fascinating. And if we turn to the records of St Ninian's Episcopal Church in Invergordon during World War II, we can see the extent to which all the branches of the armed forces were part of daily life in Invergordon once again. Here are some extracts from the church logbook through the war years, and I've just picked some random examples because the logbook is full of lists of services being given to each of the different forces, times when they're at different bases speaking to the different soldiers, and records also when the batteries changed and when different regiments came and things like that. So here are some extracts. During July, a supply of 40 new hymn books was obtained, partly by means of a grant and partly by contributions from a few members of the congregation. An additional 50 prayer and hymn books, originally intended for the use of the Navy, have been obtained from the Royal Naval Store for the use of the Royal Air Force. And then August the 17th, 1941, a service was held today at the Soldiers' Camp at Saltburn at 12 p.m, and then another at the Soldiers' Camp at Roskeen at 4 p.m. Similar services happened on the 24th. On September the 3rd, National Day of Prayer, service was held at the Royal Naval Auxiliary Hospital. March the 29th, a confirmation was administered by the Bishop of Aberdeen at 3 p.m. 3 men, 2 Royal Navy and 1 civilian from Invergordon, 2 men RAF from Tain, and 4 men and 2 women RAF from Eventon were all confirmed. So you see that how involved the church is in supporting the military at that during the Second World War as well as during the First. Now the Navy finally left in 1956, and that was a huge change for the community of Invergordon and a big part of their identity changing. And in the 1960s and 70s, industry took over. The British aluminium smelter employed around 1,000 people, providing a huge boost to the local economy until it closed in 1981. And again, I'm not going to go into that in any detail because there is an aluminium episode of Learn with Lorna if you want to go back and have a look at that, episode 59. But the other industry that came in was brought around it was brought because of the development of the oil industry. So there was work brought to Invergordon through the construction and maintenance of oil rigs. So it's a town that's had a very interesting story, from being an estate owned by several families that link with Invergordon Castle, the move through the small community to the manufacturing community to the First World War, huge important role in the First World War, and then in the Second World War, and then the aluminium smelter, the distillery, the manufacture of rigs, and so on. So it's had a very interesting history, but one thing that has been constant all the way through that story is the importance of its location on the coast and its particular deep water port, which again continues to play a huge role because of the cruise ships and the freight ships coming in. So I hope you have enjoyed that whistle-stop tour of Invergordon's history. I'm always conscious when I do these ones about towns and settlements that you can only throw some bits of stories, and there's so much more that I don't have time to talk about. If you want more information about the history of Invergordon, please do come in and have a look at the records we have. We have a huge collection. Have a look at some of the fantastic pictures on Ambala. There's some really nice ones of the naval, the home fleet based at Invergordon, some ones of the Natal as well. And also, if you're in the area, visit Invergordon Museum, who will be able to tell you a huge amount more. But thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to me going over a little bit. I love that message, Celia, that your mother-in-law worked at Inchindown, 102 when she passed away. That's fascinating. Next week, we'll be looking at some stories from the County Clerk's papers, an amazing series of records that touch on all sorts of different aspects of life within the county. That one will be pre-recorded because I'm speaking to the Highland Senior Citizens Network, who meet at exactly the same time as Lorna. So, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. The High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part. But if you're able to donate, then we're really grateful for that. And thank you for all your lovely comments. It's always so lovely to see them. Thank you.